Merci beaucoup. Enchanté.
Bienvenue.
Merci. Pour l'avancer, c'est là?
Voilà.
Très bien. Thank you so much for staying. I know the end is nigh, I promise. We've heard so many talks today. I'm going to start with a premise that I think threads through every talk we've heard, and that is that building has intrinsic value. It's not just the placement of raw materials into productive use as economic assets. It's also the nobility of building and learning crafts and learning a trade, and also the quality of life that is rendered when a building comes to life itself. Of course, we revere these monuments to classical architecture, but let's not forget, and this comes from the part of the world where I was raised, that people, ordinary people, learn how to build wonderful buildings all by themselves, learning from those who have gone before, and using materials that are at hand. And I'm going to come back to that when I close the talk. That's true in every part of the world, as I'm sure many people here know. And these vernacular buildings, the buildings that are built by ordinary people, also become places that are revered and admired. And they use principles, some of which we've heard repeated today, that have been around for time immemorial, for as long as people build. We've got two problems on top of all the rest that affect, in my opinion, architecture. This is just north of Miami, Florida. This is out in the middle west of the United States. This was in Greece last summer. This was outside of Houston, Texas, not very long ago. I could go on. The first problem has to do with extreme weather and the fact that almost everywhere on the planet, people are coping with extreme weather. For those of you who don't know centigrade, that was a temperature in Paris this summer. Ray, I'm sure you remember that, don't you? And those of us who were here this summer remember experiencing those temperatures. Every city in the world is facing rising temperatures, coupled with sea level rise. And what's happening on the eastern seaboard of the United States is quite alarming. People have coped with these issues and problems of rising and falling sea levels for centuries. What's different is the frequency and intensity of the weather that's now being experienced. This is a picture of Taiwan and some of the storms that have come across Taiwan. The second problem has to do with the rates of urbanization across the globe and the fact that people are gravitating to cities at a rate unprecedented. If we have 7.5 billion people on this planet, about 1 billion of them are building places for themselves with materials they scavenge, any place they can find to build, often tenuously and not for very long. So our cities take on a character that I call dichotomous, split. Physically, they manifest this split. They are places of poverty, but also wealth. There's illness and there's health. There's ignorance and there's education. Our cities have become these places where those contrasts are pronounced. This is Kibera in Nairobi, Kenya, the largest slum in Africa, possibly one of the largest in the world. Estimates of the population range from 1 million to 2.5 million. A huge place, sprawling. 60% of the people who live in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, 21 million or so total, live in what they call slums, places like this that people build for themselves. So our cities take on this character of dichotomy. Originally, when I put this together, I put world in crisis, but that alarms people, so I'm just going to say world in need. This is where the International Union of Architects comes in. It was founded in Lausanne, Switzerland, 71 years ago by a small number of countries, architects from those countries who believed they could make a difference. Today it has grown enormously, but it was formed in a time also of great need. In the wake of the Second World War, widespread destruction in Europe, but not just in Europe. And Pierre Vagot, a Hungarian-born architect who emigrated here to Paris, had a vision about unifying architects across the globe to make a difference in the lives of people. Who knows who this is? Raise a hand. Auguste Perret. Okay, you know, you should know. He rebuilt Le Havre, which had been devastated in the Second World War, and he was the first president of the International Union of Architects. In fact, for some 22 years or so, our offices were in his apartment in the 16th arrondissement, not that far from here. And when the apartment changed hands, we had to move, and now we are in this building, the ugliest building in Paris, according to some people. But when you're inside of it, it isn't so ugly. First of all, you can't see it, but then you get the view once you're inside. We're on the 47th floor. I use this to remind people what the UIA is for. It's self-explanatory. We have 118 member sections, I think, now, across the globe. We are doing our utmost, and I'm not going to dwell on this, to influence policies, and we're certainly making efforts to advance the profession. The organization is based on this premise, and I'm going to close on this premise. So much of what we face today is really a result of our reliance on the automobile. From the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, some statistics about a typical European automobile. Parked most of the time. When it's moving, it's looking for parking at least half the time. It seats 5, but carries you about 1.5 on average, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you were setting out to design a people mover, this is probably the last place you'd land. And our patterns of development, this happens to be North America, but frankly, it could be any exurban environment, pretty much anywhere on the globe. So much of this is dependent on the automobile. But not only that. And that's what's reflected in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. I want to talk about what our member section in Denmark is doing, and our Permanent Commission on Sustainable Development. We've said enough preaching, enough talking about climate crisis, enough of that. Let's show solutions that actually work. So we've developed and are developing a large catalog of projects all across the globe that address every single one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and that show building solutions in various climate conditions, in various socioeconomic conditions, in various parts of the world. I commend it to you. What runs through all of these projects is what we've been hearing about today, sunlight and air. That's what makes VELUX such a wonderful partner for the UIA, because they're dedicated, as this program shows, to that. We heard a call from Vivian, I think, earlier today, to focus more on commercial buildings. I echo that call. But our catalog of projects is showing ways in which architecture can help not just to sort of stem the tide of environmental problems, but also to cope with them, a legitimate role for us. I'm going to close talking about 3 architects very quickly. First, a face that's probably known to many of you, Alejandro Aravena from Chile. He did a project for copper miners in Chile. If they had been left to their own devices, their homes would have looked pretty much like some of the slides I showed earlier. He built basic infrastructure for these families and understood that they would build them out, finish them at their own pace, in their own way, using whatever materials they could find when they could afford to do so. So the end result wouldn't land you on the cover of Habitare or Architecture Aujourd'hui, although ultimately it did. But it made an enormous difference in the lives of the people who live in those buildings. Another man, another good friend, Francis Quéré, very different context, was raised in Burkina Faso, practiced in Germany, but he too is recognizing and designing with the understanding that people are building for themselves using materials that are at hand when and how they can. He's been a wonderful example of showing how to make schools, hospitals, clinics, and other buildings using materials that are easily available. Bjarke Ingels, for a different reason. Here's a man who's been able to capture the imagination of political leaders and powerful people, and has used the power of design to transform the way people think about coping with rising sea levels and climate change. Lower end of Manhattan, badly damaged in Hurricane Sandy. The first response was by the US Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps of Engineers built a giant wall to block off the water. He had a different idea. Use recreational space as a buffer between the water and where the buildings are. And when it isn't flooding, or as it begins sea level rise, it's still usable. So it's a very imaginative exploitation of the power of design. The UIA has partnered with UNESCO in a number of areas. I don't want to talk about all of them. The newest one is the World Capital of Architecture program, which is intended to highlight for the public the power of architecture to make a difference in all these matters that I've been talking about. The first World Capital of Architecture is Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Our World Congress is held every 3 years. It will be held in Rio next year in July. And we're going to emphasize how architecture addresses these problems. Copenhagen in 2023 will have its opportunity. Many people don't know that the UIA is responsible for the design competitions that produced the Sydney Opera House, the Centre Pompidou, the Tokyo World Forum, the Alexandria National Library in Egypt, and a number of other great projects. The UIA is really about showing the power of architecture to improve people's lives. Keep these dates in mind. It's going to be a great program. If you've never been to Rio, this is the time to do it. And then there's Copenhagen. The dates have probably been fixed. I've got to update my slide to make sure I get those on there. You've heard this over and over again. We all know it now. Cities are just these enormous places of humanity with so many needs. I want to close with the premise I began with. There's intrinsic value in building, and architecture has the power to help the human condition and our planet. Thanks very much.